In 2008, SpaceX had failed 3 consecutive rocket launches. Tesla was weeks from bankruptcy. Elon Musk had invested his entire personal fortune, roughly $180 million from the PayPal sale, into these 2 companies. He was borrowing money from friends to pay rent. On the verge of the 4th launch, engineers told him there was a significant chance it would fail too. If it did, SpaceX was finished. The rocket launched. It reached orbit. It was the first privately funded liquid-fueled rocket to do so. Within weeks, NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract. The company survived by approximately 3 weeks of runway. This story is intoxicating. It suggests that extreme conviction, massive risk-taking, and refusal to quit are the ingredients of greatness, and they can be. But here is what the story does not include: the thousands of entrepreneurs who took the same risks, had the same conviction, refused to quit at the same moments, and lost everything. You have never heard of them, not because they were less brave, less smart, or less determined, but because they failed, and failure does not get a biography. Today, we are going to do something the business media almost never does. We are going to study the psychology of billionaires honestly. What is genuinely brilliant? What is genuinely dangerous, and why copying them without understanding the full picture could be the most expensive mistake you ever make. Elon Musk describes his decision-making process as first principles thinking, breaking a problem down to its most fundamental truths and reasoning up from there, rather than reasoning by analogy to what already exists. When Musk wanted to build rockets, the quoted price for a refurbished ICBM was $65 million. Instead of accepting that price as a given, he asked, what are rockets actually made of? Aluminum, titanium, copper, carbon fiber. He calculated the raw material cost, roughly 2% of the quoted price, so he started a rocket company. This is not just engineering. It is a specific cognitive strategy that bypasses a psychological trap called anchoring, the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information you encounter. When someone tells you a rocket costs $65 million, that number anchors your thinking. All subsequent reasoning happens in the vicinity of that anchor. First principles thinking deliberately destroys the anchor and starts from zero. A study by Tversky and Kahneman demonstrated anchoring's power with a simple experiment. They spun a rigged wheel that landed on either 10 or 65, then asked participants to estimate the percentage of African countries in the United Nations. Those who saw 65 guessed significantly higher than those who saw 10, even though the wheel had no relation to the question. Anchoring is irrational, pervasive, and extremely difficult to overcome. Musk's first principles approach is a genuine cognitive advantage, but here is the nuance. It works when applied to physics and engineering, where fundamental truths are knowable and stable. It is far less reliable when applied to human systems, markets, politics, culture, where the fundamental variables are messy, subjective, and constantly shifting. Musk's struggles with social dynamics, public communication, and organizational culture may stem from applying an engineering mindset to domains where it does not cleanly fit. The takeaway: adopt first principles thinking for problems with objective, knowable foundations. Use it to question assumptions about cost, process, and design. But recognize its limits. Not every problem reduces to first principles. Some are irreducibly complex. In 1994, Jeff Bezos was a senior vice president at DEE. Shaw, a prestigious Wall Street hedge fund. He was 30 years old, well compensated, and on track for a very comfortable life. Then he had an idea about selling books on the internet. His boss told him it was a good idea for someone who did not already have a good job. Bezos made his decision using what he calls the regret minimization framework. He projected himself to age 80 and asked, "Will I regret not trying this?" The answer was clearly yes. Will I regret trying and failing? Probably not. The asymmetry was obvious. The regret of inaction would outweigh the regret of failure. This framework is psychologically sophisticated because it exploits a well-documented phenomenon. Research by Thomas Gilovich and Victoria Medvec at Cornell found that over time, people regret inactions more than actions. In the short term, we regret things we did, the bad investment, the failed business, the embarrassing attempt. But in the long term, those regrets fade. What persists, what gnaws at people for decades, is the thing they never tried, the conversation they never had, the leap they never took. Bezos essentially pre-computed his long-term emotional state and used it to override his short-term risk aversion. This is genuinely useful psychology. However, the framework has a blind spot. It assumes that the worst outcome of action is bearable. For Bezos, a Princeton graduate with a Wall Street resume and wealthy family investors who gave him $300,000, the downside was capped. If Amazon failed, he would have returned to finance. For someone without that safety net, the regret minimization framework can rationalize catastrophic risks. The framework is powerful but context-dependent. Your ability to absorb failure determines how aggressively you should apply it. The takeaway: use regret minimization for career decisions, relationships, and creative pursuits where the downside is recoverable. Be cautious applying it to financial decisions where the downside could be existential. The framework is a lens, not a license. Steve Jobs had a quality his colleagues called the reality distortion field, the ability to convince himself and others that the impossible was possible. Engineers would tell him a feature could not be built in the timeline he demanded. He would stare at them, insist it could be done, and somehow it would get done. Not because the timeline was realistic, but because his conviction was so intense that people bent reality to match it. This phenomenon is related to what psychologists call the Pygmalion effect, the finding that higher expectations lead to higher performance. Robert Rosenthal's famous 1968 study showed that when teachers were told certain students were about to experience an intellectual growth spurt selected at random, those students actually performed better by the end of the year. The expectation created the outcome. Jobs weaponized this effect at an organizational scale. His refusal to accept limitations became a self-fulfilling prophecy, but only because he combined it with an extraordinary ability to recruit talented people who could stretch to meet his demands. The reality distortion field does not work with mediocre execution. It works when unreasonable expectations are paired with exceptional capability. The dark side is significant. Jobs' biographer Walter Isaacson documented numerous instances where the reality distortion field crossed into cruelty, publicly humiliating employees, denying obvious facts, taking credit for others' ideas, and refusing to accept responsibility for failures. The same psychology that made him visionary also made him, by many accounts, emotionally destructive to the people around him. The takeaway: high expectations genuinely elevate performance. Setting ambitious targets and refusing to accept premature limitations is valuable. But there is a line between inspiring unreasonableness and toxic denial. The first pushes people to discover what they are capable of. The second breaks them. Learning to tell the difference is the most important leadership skill that no one teaches. Now we flip the lens entirely. Everything you have just read about Musk, Bezos, and Jobs is true. But it is dangerously incomplete because of the single most pervasive bias in how we study success: survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is the logical error of concentrating on the people who survived a selection process and ignoring those who did not. During World War II, the U.S. military analyzed bullet holes in returning aircraft and considered reinforcing the most hit areas. Statistician Abraham Wald pointed out the flaw: the planes that were hit in other areas did not return at all. The holes they could see were the ones that did not matter. When you study billionaires, you are looking at the returning aircraft. Thousands of entrepreneurs took the same risks as Musk, had the same conviction as Bezos, and had the same intensity as Jobs. They failed. Their stories are not told. Their frameworks are not studied. Their psychology is not analyzed. And because you only see the survivors, you draw a false causal link between their specific traits and their success. A study by Jerkert and Rell at Stanford showed that in competitive environments with high variance, the most successful outcomes are disproportionately likely to involve extreme risk-taking. Not because extreme risk-taking is a good strategy, but because it is the only strategy that produces the extreme outcomes we notice. The moderate risk-takers who did well are invisible because their success is unremarkable. The extreme risk-takers who failed are invisible because we do not study failure. You are left with a biased sample that makes recklessness look like genius. The takeaway: study billionaires for inspiration, not for instruction. Their frameworks are interesting, their traits are worth understanding. But do not confuse correlation with causation. Many of their most celebrated qualities, extreme risk tolerance, obsessive focus, disregard for convention, are just as present in spectacular failures. Context, timing, luck, and privilege are the variables that separate the biography from the bankruptcy. There is a body of research that the business media rarely discusses. A study by Charles O'Reilly and colleagues at Stanford found that CEOs who score high on narcissism scales tend to pursue bolder strategies, make larger acquisitions, and generate more extreme outcomes, both positive and negative. Narcissistic leaders are overrepresented among both the most successful and the most catastrophic corporate leaders. This is not a coincidence. The same traits that drive extraordinary achievement, grandiose self-belief, resistance to criticism, relentless pursuit of a personal vision, are clinically associated with narcissistic personality features. This does not mean every billionaire is a narcissist. It means the traits we celebrate in successful founders overlap significantly with traits that cause harm in personal relationships, employee well-being, and organizational culture. Musk's former wife described their marriage as a subordination of her identity to his mission. Bezos's early Amazon employees described conditions that were physically and emotionally unsustainable. Jobs was estranged from his first daughter for years and publicly denied paternity despite a positive DNA test. These are not footnotes. They are data points about the psychological cost of the obsession we romanticize. A 2019 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who achieve extraordinary career success report significantly lower satisfaction in their personal relationships. Not because success makes relationships harder, but because the obsessive focus required for extreme achievement actively depletes the resources, time, emotional energy, presence that relationships need. The takeaway, the billionaire mindset, is not a menu where you can select the qualities you want and skip the ones you do not. The obsession, the risk tolerance, the reality distortion, they come as a package, and the package includes personal costs that biographies mention in Chapter 11 and readers forget by Chapter 12. Before you decide to think like a billionaire, decide if you are willing to live like one. The full version, not the highlight reel. So what do we actually take from studying these minds? From Musk, question your assumptions. The price you were quoted, the timeline you were given, the limitation you were told, these may be anchors, not truths. Reason from fundamentals when fundamentals are knowable. From Bezos, optimize for long-term regret, not short-term comfort. The things you did not try will haunt you more than the things you tried and failed, but only when the downside is survivable. From Jobs, expect more from yourself and others than seems reasonable. High expectations, communicated with conviction, genuinely elevate performance. But monitor the line between demanding and destructive. And from the graveyard of invisible failures, remember that you are studying the survivors. Adjust for luck, timing, privilege, and context. Do not confuse their story with a universal formula. The most dangerous psychology behind billionaire thinking is not any single bias or trait. It is the belief that their psychology is the cause of their success, and that replicating it will replicate their outcomes. It will not. You are a different person in a different context, with different resources and constraints. The useful lesson is smaller and more honest than any business book will sell you. Think clearly. Question assumptions. Take calculated risks where the downside is survivable. Hold yourself to high standards. And remember that the people who tell you to risk everything and never quit are the ones for whom that advice happened to work. The ones for whom it did not are not around to warn you. That is not a motivational closing line. But it might be the most valuable thing a billionaire study has ever taught you.